Deuteronomy. Listen, you heavens, and I will speak. Hear, you earth, the words of my mouth. Let my teaching fall like rain, and my words descend like dew, like showers on new grass, like abundant rain on tender plants. I will proclaim the name of the Lord. Oh, praise the greatness of our God. He is the rock. His works are perfect, and all his ways are just. A faithful God who does no wrong, upright and just is he. In verse 43, rejoice, you nations, with his people, for he will avenge the blood of his servants. He will take vengeance on his enemies and make atonement for his land and people. And then Luke 18, 1-8. Then Jesus told his disciples a parable to show them that they should always pray and not give up. He said, in a certain town there was a judge who neither feared God nor cared what people thought. And there was a widow in that town who kept coming to him with the plea, grant me justice against my adversary. For some time he refused, but finally he said to himself, even though I don't fear God or care what people think, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will see that she gets justice, so that she won't eventually come and attack me. And the Lord said, listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off? I tell you, he will see that they get justice, and quickly. However, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth?
Well, last week in our series about getting to know God, understanding who he is, we had a change in the focus of this series as we moved into what is the second half of our sermons, which is now looking at God's character. For the first few weeks, we looked at how God is different to us. So we looked at how God is eternal and how he has always existed and always will exist. And we also looked at how he is infinite, as he is everywhere and he can do all things and that he knows all things. But then starting last week, we moved into topics looking at God's moral character. And we started by looking at how he is love. And not just that he is loving or that he's capable of love, but more than that, that he is actually the source of all love. And as this is who God is, as opposed to something that God can do, that this is why love is something that he has actually made into his creation and is therefore something that he has made into us as well, as we are actually in his image and we share his traits. That this is something that we have in common with God, unlike those eternal things. And even though we may not share them perfectly, as our ability to love is obviously limited, and at times we will pervert what love is by calling acts which are evil love, or even calling acts of what is true love, we'll call them evil. That even if we don't always get it right, we still do have this trait, hence why we can come to know God's love personally. We can actually understand that, as we can even come together as a church and we can love those around us. We can love our neighbors. So God has made us to know in our nature what love is. And he's therefore now called us to love himself and also for us to love each other. And now today we'll look at another of these moral attributes that goes along with this. And that is that God is just. That yes, he is loving, as we spent time looking at last week, but this actually goes along with his justice, hence why his love operates in a framework. And he isn't just giving us whatever we want because he's just so loving. That the reason why we today can actually lose what is a true sense of what love is because we've lost a true sense of what right and wrong is. But God being a just God, well, unlike us, he will not turn a blind eye to sin in the name of love, as this would go against his character. This is another part of what makes him who he is. So what I mean by this is, if you think of our world today, often what is called loving or being loving to others is, in fact, on many, many occasions, just simply allowing sin to go unchecked. That the idea of telling someone no, or stating that their actions or their behaviors or whatever are wrong. Well, today, doing that is considered to be unloving, and true love, therefore, would be basically allowing anything to go, just affirming what everyone wants. But if we're to hold that there is an objective right and wrong, and that there really is evil in the world, and that evil must be opposed for the sake of those who would be victims of evil acts, then it's impossible to simply allow anything to go by claiming that saying no would be unloving or unfair to someone else. Hence why our world works in contradictory ways, because whilst it might hold to this idea of all things being permissible for someone, in reality, that liberty to make things permissible for them often comes at the expense of another person. So there's a contradiction in what really matters and how we actually show love to people, which is why we often find ourselves trying to understand why our society makes the weird decisions that it does. And it's because it has a twisted sense of right and wrong. And that twisted sense inevitably leads to what is a twisted understanding of what love should be. But what we're going to see today is that even if our world has no idea of right or wrong, and because of its confusion, evil often reigns, and this is why there can be so much injustice in the world. Well, the good news is that God is not prone to this mistake, and he's not, because in his character, God is just. He's a God of justice, and he'll make sure that all evils are dealt with, and that therefore all sin is accounted for. That he is all loving, but he is also just, and this brings a balance to everything that he does. So looking at this topic now, the obvious question that needs to be answered is, what do we mean by God being just? Right? How is this one of his moral attributes? How does this work? Or maybe even the first question before that needs to be asked is, what exactly is justice? Right? If we're going to say that God is a just God, and that is in his very nature, that's what we're declaring about him, well, what really is true justice? Well, what is that in itself? And to answer that, there are a couple of main things to look at so as to fully understand how justice works and how it has to work. That there are two aspects that need to happen if we're to see justice being done right, because if you fail to apply either, then an injustice will have occurred. So the first thing to think about in regards to what justice is that being just is simply applying a law. It's basically just upholding a set of rules that outline what is right and wrong, and making sure that they're applied consistently and that they're being applied fairly. So in practice, justice simply means that if someone commits a crime, that they then have to pay a penalty for it. That if someone stole or if they broke something, then they should have to make up for it, as they should compensate the person who they have harmed so as to right the wrong that they have done. Which is why we read in the Bible well-known verses like Exodus 21 in verse 24 that says things like an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth. The idea simply being that if someone does something wrong, then they should have to pay for that in an equal measure, and it would be unjust for them to just get away with it. Which is something that everyone, if they were the victim of someone else's wrongdoing, someone did something wrong to them, well, they would probably actually be very happy to agree with this idea of an eye for an eye. All right, you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who believes that if someone wrongs them personally, that other person should simply get away with it, as the idea of justice and fair play, it's something that we have in our own nature. That just like love that we looked at last week, this also is something that God has built into his creation, as we are in his image. So just like him, we also share this desire for justice. We want to see justice done. So think for yourself, if someone stole something off you, would you want them to just be able to keep it? Or if someone broke something, should they be allowed to not have to replace it? And the obvious answer to both those scenarios is that they shouldn't get away with what they've done wrong, and they should have to make things right. They would have to either return or replace what they stole, and would have to replace or compensate you for what they broke, as it'd be unjust for the damage they've done not to be rectified. And the reason that we would think like that is simply because we all want justice, and we don't want people to get away with doing wrong things to us. It's a pretty true thing for almost everyone. Even people who do the wrong thing, they don't like being on the receiving end. They don't want people to do wrong to them and get away with it. So there's the first thing to know. Justice is simply the need to right wrongdoings. That if someone commits a crime or if they harm someone else, then they shouldn't be able to get away with it. And God has made us to also have this same desire for justice as is in his own nature. As he wants his creation to have order, so we too desire to live in an orderly society where those who do wrong are in fact actually held accountable. But the second thing we need to understand with justice, and it very much has to go along with that first point, is that justice has to be fair. That the punishment has to fit the crime, and it also has to be applied to everyone equally. That no one wants to see some people above the law, nor do they want to see draconian overreactions to small offences, and certainly no one wants to see penalties being applied to the innocent who haven't even committed the crime, as all those things would be a perversion of true justice. That there can be no justice if there is an injustice in the application of it. So, for example, if you're driving a car and you got pulled over for speeding, whilst you might deserve a ticket for being 10 over, you're not going to be too impressed if someone goes flying past at that same moment doing like 100 or something over, and the cop who's fining you just shrugs their shoulders at what is this greater offence. Right? This is something that any of us would see as an injustice, as the laws are clearly not being applied to all people, but only to some, and in this case, only applied to yourself. And likewise, you're not going to be too impressed if the penalty for going 10 over the limit was something ridiculous. If it was like a $10,000 fine, if they took your license, if they impounded the car, if you had to do 6 months jail. There'd be no justice in such a penalty as what could have just been an innocent mistake, just 10 over on the highway, maybe even going down a hill. That now gets a larger penalty than some actual serious crimes. And of course, even worse, if you happen to be doing 10 under and the cop just fined you anyway because he just doesn't like you very much, well, there's going to be also a sense of injustice, as there's now a penalty being applied for no crime committed. So we know justice has to be fair. Everyone gets the same punishment for the same crime, and that penalty, it's got to be equivalent to the wrongdoings that were made. Which is why those Bible verses that speak of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, well, that's what these instructions are really going on about. The whole point of those verses are to say that it's not to be about revenge, which is how a lot of people read them, but instead it's saying that whatever the response to someone else's wrongdoing, it's got to be fair. It's got to be in proportion. The penalty can't be more than their original offense. So it can't be someone stole your pen, so you then get to take their car to make up for what they've done. That they've wronged you, so you now get to retaliate however you see fit. Instead, justice, it has to be reasonable, because it's not justice if the penalty and the offence, if they're not in balance. Hence why it has to be an eye for an eye. So there's the basis of what justice is. Justice is simply the need to right wrongdoings and making sure in the process of righting that wrong, that the application of it is fair to all and not only applied to some, and that whatever the response to that offence is, that it's measured and equal to the damage done, and it's not an act of unlimited revenge. That you don't create an injustice in the application of justice. Which is why when we look at this aspect of God's character, which is what we're focusing on today, that's the whole point of this morning. When we look at this, we actually get some really good news. That the reason why we read verses like an eye for an eye in the Bible, and why we see so many passages that talk about justice and the right application of justice, it is because God is just and he does this right in these ways. That he's the very things that we've just talked about as he applies his rules of right and wrong to all people. And he applies them fairly, and that there can be no question of him being unjust, as nothing can corrupt his judgments. And this part of God's character, whilst this is something that we can relate with, as this is in our nature as well, it also connects with a lot of what we've already looked at so far during this series, as it's by God's other attributes that he is the one and only complete just being. See, we've spent several weeks now looking at God's what we call transcendent qualities. Those things that make him different to us, that we don't fully understand, as he's just simply beyond us. But when we look at the fact that he is holy and that he's set apart and he's outside of creation, and therefore he's unable to be corrupted by the things in this creation, the sin in this universe, then this is why he can make just judgments, as he just cannot be manipulated or pressured from things outside of him. Nor can he be tempted to act in an unjust way within himself by having selfish or evil intent, as he is perfect in all that he does. That's why he is holy. Likewise, when we think of his infinite nature, the fact that he sees the past and the present and the future, and he knows all this completely, as he is eternal and he lives outside of time. And also how he is in all places. And therefore he knows all things, meaning that there are simply no facts or critical bits of information that he's unaware of. What this all means is that when God administers justice and he deals with those who have done wrong, he cannot be mistaken or be unfair in his judgments, as he knows exactly what happened and why they did what they did. So his judgments always have to be perfectly fair, as he cannot make a mistake, nor can he have any gaps in the information that he is basing his judgments on. And then we also think back to last week, and we consider how in his nature he is love, and that he does nothing from vindictiveness or from wrongful motives. It's just not in him to be like that. Then when you put all this together, his infinite attributes, his moral attributes, we can know that the justice of God is right, and it truly is just, as by his nature, as by who he is. His decisions can only be impartial and fair, and he cannot be influenced or deceived by personal bias or favoritism or any kind of external evil forces. Nothing can lead him to doing the wrong thing. And the fact that God is like this, well, this has a couple of important ramifications for us in how we deal with the wrongs of this world. That this is not just some abstract idea about God, but his justice, it is simply what makes the world work. Because as God is this way, it's why this desire for justice is in our nature as well, because he made us to seek and want justice just like himself. And that, like his love, we may be limited in this, and we may have a distorted understanding at times of true justice. But as we looked at before, we'll often know injustice when we see it, and certainly when we experience it, as we'll seek to have good order in our life and society. And because God is in his nature just, and that he is perfectly just, and has revealed his ways to us, well, this is how we can know what injustice looks like, as he gives us a way of measuring what is good and bad. That the reason why we today can say that this is wrong, and why we can say that this thing over here, this is evil, and why something must be done to right what is a wrong. Well, it's because God, by who he is and what he's revealed to us, he's given us the framework to know what is good and bad, and to recognize injustice when we see it. That by God being perfect himself, and by him being in his nature perfectly just, we can know what good looks like, and we can therefore recognize evil by simply contrasting it to what is God's holy ways. So there's the next thing to know today. We've looked at what justice is. It's dealing with wrongs and what is a fair and a balanced way. But now the good news is that this is what God does, as this is who he is. That just like how he is love, well, he is also just, and he'll not let the guilty get away with their sin, but he'll justly judge all things. Now, knowing all this has to create a couple of responses from ourselves to God's rightful justice. The fact that God is just has huge significance for ourselves, as we just looked at. It's going to change the way we look at the world. But more than this, it also is what gives us hope when things are bad. And it is also what will give us self-control, as we'll come to know and depend on God's perfect justice, and we'll learn to trust in him in this. And we see this in our passages this morning. We haven't looked at them yet. We've got halfway through the sermon. We haven't even really looked at the Bible other than one verse. But now that we've had a thought about what justice means, we're going to look at several passages now. We're going to make up for that. And we see here in these passages, the two we've read out plus some others, how this should impact the way that we come before God, and how we should live in what is so often an unjust world. How do we deal with that? So we see in our Deuteronomy passage that we read out before, but it says this: I will proclaim the name of the Lord. Oh, praise the greatness of our God. He is the rock. His works are perfect, and all his ways are just. A faithful God who does no wrong, upright and just is he. So because of what we've talked about before, how his ways are perfect and how he judges all things fairly and justly, well, this is why we depend on him and not on ourselves or the world around us, in order to bring true justice and in order to make things right. And this is simply because only God can be depended on to do this. Hence why it says here that he is the rock, as he is the one that we are to build our hope on, as only he can be trusted. Because in our world, we often see injustice and we see wrong things happen all the time. And as I said before, we know it when we see it because we want justice. When someone wrongs us, we want it to be made right. And when we see these horrible things happen in our world, with people committing crimes and then getting away with it, and people hurting others and nothing being done about it, and likewise, people lying about other people doing the wrong thing, but then they haven't, so the innocent get punished for the things that they didn't even do. All of this stuff, right? All of it does it, or at least should, get us angry. And get us angry because we're powerless to right these injustices, yet we want them fixed up. We don't have to like it. We should definitely dislike it. And we're going to be angry at the fact that we can't do anything about it. But knowing that God is loving and that he is just in his very nature, and knowing that God will never let the innocent pay for something that they didn't do, and he'll never let the guilty get away with their wrongdoings, nor will he show favoritism, as he'll always treat everyone fairly, and he will make the punishment fit the crime. And on top of that, knowing in his infinite nature that he is all-knowing, so he can't be anything but fair and right in his judgments, because he knows exactly what happened, every last detail. All of this gives us hope, because we know that by God, all will be made right. As justice is in his nature, and as he is infinite and can do all things, we can know that he will carry that justice out. God will act. So it's not like us, who may see an injustice and we want to right it, but we're just powerless to do anything about it, because God's other attributes, knowing those things about him, means that we never have to worry that evil will prevail, as he will always right all wrongs. He will fix everything. Which is why this is good news for us. And it's why we see in our other passage that we're told to never cease praying for God's justice, as he wants us to call upon him. That when we face or we see an injustice in this world, we are to turn to him, and we're to never give up calling his intervention. That we can have hope, because we can pray to this just God who will fix all things. See, in the Luke passage, it starts off by talking about a judge of this world, who just doesn't care about justice. It says in verse 2 that he neither feared God nor cared what people thought. So the guy's just virtually like just a sociopath. He just doesn't care about others. He doesn't care about right or wrong. So it's showing what is the corruption of sin in this world, as even a judge cannot be trusted to be just. Which is why we then see in verse 3 that this desperate widow, someone who has very little support and has very little power in that time, she's pleading with him by saying, grant me justice against my adversary. And he just keeps refusing. He keeps refusing because he just doesn't care about her or about justice for those who have been wronged. But despite his indifference to a situation, we see that she just keeps asking for his intervention. She just keeps going back to him. And it's by her persistence, he eventually does his job as a judge. It says in verse 5, because this widow keeps bothering me, I will see that she gets justice, so that she won't eventually come and attack me. So his motives are obviously wrong. He's still a corrupt judge, and he only acts out of self-interest. But nevertheless, her persistence pays off, and he does do the right thing. He eventually does his job. Which is why we get what is the big point of this in verses 6 and 7, where it says, listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off? So the point is that even an unjust judge will eventually do the right thing if pushed, if asked enough times. Even if it's out of self-interest, eventually perseverance will pay off. And if that's true for an unjust judge of this world, someone that just doesn't care about justice or people, then we can know God will do what is right, as he is the just judge. He's a total opposite. And he's not a corrupt person like the man in this parable. That all that we've looked at this morning has been about the fact that God is just. That is who and what he is. So he's not going to turn a blind eye to injustice. He will do something. So this is why we can trust him, which is why we should never stop calling on his intervention. We should always pray to him when injustice arises. But as we get to the end of this parable, we get both a message of hope and a warning as well. Because it says here, I tell you, he will see that they get justice and quickly. However, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? So the warning being given here is, don't give up trusting in God. Trust in what is his time to deal with these things. Because as we looked at right at the start of this series, God is eternal. And he doesn't work by our time frames. Because we might want an answer today, but God may be saying, just wait. Wait a week or a month or a year, maybe even wait a decade or more, maybe even wait until his son, Christ, returns, as all things will be judged on that day. Maybe even after our lifetime, we might have to wait, but it will happen. So what this means is we need to be patient and accept that there is, at this time, at this moment, before Christ returns, there is evil in this world, and it just has to be, unfortunately, tolerated. But if we do have faith and trust in God's justice, we know that something will be done. So we need to keep calling on him in the meantime, keep praying to him when we face injustice. And if we are keeping the faith, and if we are in fact waiting on him, then the practical side of this will have large consequences for how we deal with evil and how we tolerate these injustices that we see in this world. This is what's going to drive our decisions and our responses and even our state of mind to the wrongs that we have to face. So imagine if you were wronged, right? Imagine that an injustice has been done to you or someone that you know. There might be a desire to get even, a desire to make the other person pay and to take matters into your own hands. But if you have faith and trust in the justice of God, then you can know that you don't have to do anything as God has it under control. As we read in the book of Romans, in chapter 12, Paul talks about how we are to love others, to bless even those who persecute us, and to be sincere in this. Not fake, but to genuinely love even our enemies. And then when we get down to verse 17, we read this. He says here, do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, it is mine to avenge. I will repay, says the Lord. So if we believe in God as the judge of all things, and that he's just in his judgments, and that he will deal with all sin, then we can hand our issues over to him. And we're not going to seek our own justice in this world or doubt that God will eventually do anything. That knowing who God is and what he has called us to do, it's going to impact our lives as we will call on him, just like the widow in the parable, and not stop praying for his justice to be done. And we see back in our Deuteronomy passage, that one verse down in verse 43. It says, rejoice your nations with his people, for he will avenge the blood of his servants. He will take vengeance on his enemies and make atonement for his land and people. And this was said to Israel at the time as a reminder to never lose hope in God's protection of them. That wrongs will happen and a lot of wrong things have happened to them, but God will make things right. So trust in him to handle it. And again, as we read in our Luke passage in verse 7, where it said before, will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? All this, it's all about not taking matters into our own hands, but knowing that God, being just, that he will look after us. He'll look after his chosen ones. He'll look after his people. He'll look after his children, so we don't have to worry. Which is also why, when we pray, we will pray what Jesus told us to pray, which is, your kingdom come. Because we know that is when justice will come. That when Jesus returns, all things will be made right. So knowing God's justice, it's given us hope in that day. That's what we're looking forward to. when all the wrongs are made right and justice is done perfectly. But today, in the meantime, if we lose faith, if we doubt, well, we will take matters into our own hands. And then our hope, it's not going to be in Jesus' return. And by our actions, that will be shown. It will be clear if we are trusting in God's justice or if we're doubting his sincerity. And it's going to be evident by whether we take matters into our own hands or if we call on him to act. If when we see an injustice, when we suffer an injustice, if our reaction is to get even, eye for an eye, or if it's to pray and hand it over to him. So to finish up this morning, what all this means for us, it's a couple of things. We can summarize it down to just a couple of big things. Firstly, when we see bad things happen in the world, when we see people doing awful things, crime, murder, war, every time you turn the news on, when people do wrong and they seem to get away with it, well, the thing to know is that God also sees it in his infinite knowledge, and in his just nature, he will deal with it. This is why when we read the very last verse of Ecclesiastes, right, a book which almost comes across as having no hope, right? What's there to look forward to? Everything's meaningless. But it actually gives us something pretty big at the end. For it says, for God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. And it says that because God will judge all things, good and bad. And that is something to give us hope. Because we don't have to worry about the injustices we see or even experience. We just have to call out to him and trust in him. And we do that because God is just and he'll not let sin go unpunished. All things will be dealt with. And the second thing to know is that when God judges the world, it will be fair. As we looked at, God is just. He won't be corrupt in any way in his judgments. And as we looked at last week, God is love. And these two things very much go together. It was because of God's love that he sent Jesus to save us from judgment. That he sent Jesus to save us from our sin, and he sent him to take our punishment for us. And why Jesus had to take it, and why God couldn't just pretend that our sin doesn't matter, well, it's because justice demands it. It would not be justice to let any sin go unpunished. But because God loves us, well, he also shows us grace and forgiveness, and it's why he took the sin upon himself. It's why he sent Jesus to save us from our sin. So this is what we see happen on the cross. We see justice and love working together. Justice is our sin being punished, all sin being dealt with, and love is that Jesus takes that punishment on himself. Which is why this is so important for us to know. It's important that we know and understand that God is a God of justice and love. And that's why we can be trusting in him and why we should be thankful that we get to know a God like that. Because if we only focused on just God's justice, well, we might come to see him as being cold, calculated, obsessed with only points of law. But the way God's justice is presented is one of fairness and of forgiveness and of second chances. Not in a way that has him breaking his own laws, not in a way that has him going against his very nature. He doesn't turn a blind eye to sin, but in a way that has him justly dealing with sin, as Jesus did on the cross, and also at the same time has him restoring the sinner by taking that sin from us. That's the good news message that comes from this. We can have the hope and trust in God's justice and also know that because of his love, that the way he'll deal with our sin will be in a fair and a balanced way.